Hi there, my name's Donald Ritchie. Welcome to my presentation on my Action Inquiry project. Before I begin, I'd like to respectfully acknowledge the country on which this presentation is being recorded and where the inquiry occurred. I'd like to acknowledge the Wamba people as the traditional owners of this country and pay my respects to elders past, present, and emerging. The learning issue that this inquiry project focused on was students reading, both their attitudes to reading and their reading comprehension levels. So a bit of indicative data to say why that was selected. Here's the PAT reading level for the Year 10 class that the inquiry focused on. This is at the start of the year. Many students at the Year 4 reading comprehension level, Year 6 or Year 7 level. And here again, their PAT reading, their NAPLAN reading data from last year. You can see that the Year 9 cohort, the current Year 10 cohort, because this is last year's data, only 18% of them were at level. So in those top 3 bands. So that's compared to the 35% in other schools and 43, similar schools and 43% across the state. Bit of indicative data, sort of qualitative data. You have the attitudes to reading surveys from the very beginning of the unit, where you can see that only 2 students read in their free time on the left-hand side, and only 4 enjoyed reading. And here, time reading per day, so only 1 student was reading more than 20 minutes outside of class, and most of them were reading not at all outside of class. So the goals of the program were to improve PAT reading scores, so to have the growth equivalent of 1 year for each student, and to improve enjoyment of reading. So have students reading more often outside of class and enjoy that reading more. The research question that framed the inquiry was, what happens to students' reading comprehension and attitudes to reading when sustained independent reading, conferencing, and explicit instruction of reading techniques are combined? So the pedagogical model focused on 3 areas: independent reading, explicit teaching around reading strategies and vocabulary, and conferencing. So I'll go into depth in those in a moment. The literature that backed this up, though, so we wanted to stay in silent reading because the literature shows that students who read more have better results. Students that read every day are more likely to be at level or above level. And students engaging in independent reading, it really helps those whether they're at low reading level or at a high reading level. So note down the bottom there, independent reading must be done with supports. That's where the other 2 elements of my pedagogical model came into play. So conferencing is a clear support that helps. Independent reading is more effective with conferencing as part of the program, mainly because students are engaged more, so they do better. And conferencing creates accountability, which leads to a deeper engagement. The explicit vocabulary and gamification and the explicit instruction. So explicit instruction is arguably the most effective way of improving reading. That's because up to 80% of reading comprehension is recognition and understanding of words, the other 20 being inference. So the paradigm used to frame this study was pragmatism. That's because we were looking at both qualitative and quantitative data, and pragmatism has the flexibility and really puts value on both those types of data. So what actually happened in the intervention had visits to the library reasonably often to select books for students to get books. Actually, if we take it a step before that, the English department bought a whole lot of books that were suited to and at level, but also of interest to our student body. So they included books on basketball, manga, all sorts of books that we thought our students would like. We went down, hired them, and each day we read for 10 to 15 minutes. And then students would log in the reader's log, which you can see on the right-hand side, some information, so how many pages they read, and an exercise from the explicit instruction. So you can see here, we also had conferencing, where students would have a moment to, well, at the very start of the intervention, set a goal, a SMART goal, and then throughout check in on that goal to see how students are going. We also had explicit instruction, which changed throughout the course from explicit instruction of vocab to explicit instruction of reading strategies. So those reading strategies ranged from summarizing to questioning, that sort of technique, and that's what would be written down in the reader's log. Planned data collection. Conference week was the very first thing we did, where we had conferences set goals based on the initial PAT data. We had enjoyment of reading surveys. I had 3 of those, as you can see, 25th of July, 3rd of September, 30th of October, all the way through to gauge how people's enjoyment of reading was increasing or not. We had ACE PAT testing planned for midway and the end. That actually ended up only just being the end because the English department thought we were doing too much of that. So we had that there recently in the 4th of November. So the planned analysis methods. The planned analysis was to compare the means of the quantitative data of the PAT reading scores, and also pick out data points that seem to that were of interest. And in terms of the qualitative data, was to look at so the reading surveys, to look at the thematic trends, and also to pick out student quotes and extrapolate what they meant. So ethical concerns. The ethical concern really that we had the most was around storage of student data, and I worked around that by storing all student data on the secure school server. So here we go, the actual data. So you can see here on the left-hand side, the pre-intervention PAT data and the post-intervention PAT data, and the mean in this quadrant here. A slightly surprising result was that the mean increased along with the standard deviation increasing. So didn't look great off here. Of interest though was that 2 students in the 45-minute testing period sort of bombed out. One has, well, certainly didn't give it their best. And then refused to take the test again. So they had actually decreased from the year 4 reading level to a pre-kinder reading level, and they'd clicked through in 5 minutes, both of them together. And so their data was seen to be not very accurate, and I took those data points out in order to have a better idea of the true of the impact of the reading inquiry project. So what we see here with those 2 students' data not in there is an increase in reading comprehension, albeit a small increase. So this comparing of the mean is quite broad. So I put the data into a box plot, and here you can see it's tells a bit more of a story. So the median increases, and in particular, the second quartile increases. The highest student is pretty well the same, and the lowest student has gone down. So this suggests that that the intervention really helped the mid-range students the most. Didn't seem to do much for the top-range student. And as I said, the bottom-range student, the data points are hard to tell due to what I explained before, not taking the testing particularly seriously. So that's the quantitative data. The qualitative data seems a little more hopeful, and this is the comparing the mid-intervention and post-intervention on 3 measures. The amount read, this is the first one. So the amount that students are reading inside the class, outside the class. And what you can see here, 4 students in the midpoint were reading more, whereas post-intervention, 11 students were reading more outside the class, which was great to see. You can sort of, you could infer from that a culture of reading was starting to form. Enjoyment of reading, again, increased. So from mid-intervention, where 4 students said that they'd enjoyed reading more, to post-intervention with 8 students saying that they were enjoying reading more, which is, again, quite promising data. And thirdly, we had reading at home. So in the middle of the intervention, only 1 student still, there was 1 at the beginning and 1 at the middle, only 1 student was reading at home. Whereas towards the end of the intervention, 6 were reading at home. And I think we can really infer that the enjoyment of reading had increased from this, and a culture and habit of reading outside class had begun to form, which was great. We have here 4 quotes. Go through them briefly. Mister, I've read 6 books. Bet you didn't think I'd read that many. This was from a student who at the start said that she hated reading and then got stuck into a reading. She started reading a graphic novel, and that progressed into a series where they got more and more until it was a full text, and the 300-page novel is what she ended with. So you can see a real confidence from the differentiated reading. So the differentiated text types, the content, really gave her a sense of confidence. I think the same can be said for I Can Do VCE, the second quote, which is a sense of confidence from this was a Laboti student, language background other than English, and she had really gained a lot of confidence in her understanding of text. She ended up reading, I think she read 15 books. So the importance of text selection you can see in the third quote. I don't like reading, but this book is awesome. So giving students books on topics that they're interested in was a real takeaway from that. And this last one, sorry, mister, I left my reading book at home. So although seems like a bit of an excuse, I took a lot of heart from because it shows that the culture and habits of reading are starting to form. Both the book was taken home and taken out of the bag, which was a fantastic start. So this calmness of reading time, you can see with the number of disruptions on the y-axis and each session as we went through the reading program, those disruptions really started to go down as students got more and more engrossed in their books. Well, you can infer that students were getting more into their books, and it complements that data on the enjoyment of reading. So now onto the discussion, and this is where we'll start is the engagement and enjoyment, and that actually increased. So the survey results show that student engagement with reading and enjoyment of reading increased broadly across the class, and an appreciation of how reading can improve English skills increased too. So in combining the findings of the student quotes and the reading surveys, it's clear that providing differentiated reading material improves student confidence and enjoyment of reading. The quantitative data showed interesting trends too. Whilst there was growth for readers overall, this growth was mostly restricted to the middle section of the class. There was very little for the lower section, lower readers and the top readers. So this suggested that the explicit instruction of reading strategy was pitched towards the middle, and it failed to push the higher students and support the lower students. This is a really clear improvement that could be made for the future. Providing explicit instruction that's differentiated for all the students in the class would likely lead to more growth for higher students in particular. So we look at some other elements of improvement. So it's difficult to pin down the element of the pedagogical model that led to improving student reading comprehension. If we consider that there's individual learning experience, there were a number of things that occurred which likely affected the success of the learning. So firstly, having books in the hand of students is likely to have an impact. So as I showed before in Allington and the literature before, it's explicit that the more students read, the better their comprehension. Now, the differentiation of reading level and topics too is something that certainly seems to have had an impact, and it made an impact, and that so the improvement in many students' attitude to reading suggests that having those accessible texts improves student interest in reading. And the explicit reading comprehension, although as mentioned before, only seemed to help the mid-range students, it certainly seems to have made an impact on those students. So implications and application for the future. The implications from this research is that independent reading of at-level and age-appropriate text increases student enjoyment of reading. It's suggested that the reading program continue at Robinvale College, and that independent programs, the implication is that they do improve student reading comprehension. However, they're only as beneficial as the supports that go along with them. It's clear from this study that students who did not receive adequate supports didn't show the expected growth. So therefore, future programs should incorporate explicit instruction that's able to cater to all students in the class to ensure growth for all students. That's the area that would need the most improvement, is the explicit instruction. That's it from me. Thank you very much for listening.